today. Phone ringing off the shelf. I guess somebody had something really wanna prove to us today. Waking up pretty late for any place. No use in the explain it, my loved ones today. but something's always in the way. Alright, what now? That's fine. Think I'm ready to claim what's mine, rightfully. Crestfallen, dejected, with the East Coast crush, death dreaming through the dark days. Club Mate on holiday, with the moon duo, space partners. Alright, what now? That's fine. I think I'm ready to claim what's mine, rightfully. The time has come, and I think I came to win, ever so slightly. I could call this sort of my way, baby, stay. Spirit in the sky, transparent to the eye, talking trash on nothing that you and I can see anyway, and that's it I get for you and me. When out of this world is out of mind, there was a time in my life when they thought I was off the talk. Now I'm being stalked by guys walking. I got the upper hand, walking. Now take a look at my hands.
Yes, he's
Watch 'em go.
but you know, look at
Watch
them
me
now.
go, yeah, I'm going, yeah, I'm gone.
I'm working with a couple of other people on this one.
Left-handed smoke shifting from my right hand man. Can you sense the snag in my plan? Spirit in the ether from my right wing sister. Sister says she don't care that much. There was a time in my life that is gone. I sometimes still go back to. Not to be all stalking myself too much. When I got the upper hand here in present days. Now take a look at my hands. Watch me go. Watch me go. Yeah, I'm going. Yeah, I'm gone.
Good evening. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to everyone here tonight. My name is Richard Larkins and I have the privilege of being the Chancellor of La Trobe University. Tonight's event is part of La Trobe's Ideas in Society program, convened by our esteemed Emeritus Professor and Vice-Chancellor's Fellow, Robyn Mann, who's in our audience tonight. In this program, some of the big issues facing Australia and humankind in general are discussed by those best informed to address them. Central to the series is the conviction of many that Australia is a fortunate and wealthy country and it could behave more generously and justly both at home and internationally. There is disquiet that our politicians are ignoring the need for decisions and policies affecting the long-term future of Australia and its place in the world, and instead of focusing on short-term populist issues that opinion polls suggest might help them to get re-elected in the next election, and worse still, on personal rivalries and power struggles directed towards individual ambition, political survival, and personal revenge. This series wishes, in a non-partisan way, to examine some of the big issues, inviting the most informed to take part in an open discussion with plenty of opportunity for audience participation. It can be argued that no issue is more important to the long-term future of the planet than climate change. But no issue is more mired in the conflict between short-term political point scoring and sound long-term science-based policy. And no country has made such a mess of designing a sensible policy that not only addresses our Paris commitments, but also puts our country on a path to make our contribution to a worldwide effort to contain the rise in temperature to manageable levels and to transition to a clean and sustainable future. Trump's America is challenging Australia in terms of its attempt to reverse progress made in that country, but strong action in many of the more populous states, together with advancing renewable technologies, will probably thwart Trump's efforts to sabotage the Paris Agreement and to resurrect dying industries such as coal mining and coal-fired electricity generation. Tonight we have two panellists who are ideally qualified to address the parallel problems of what we could and should be doing in terms of clean energy generation and other methods of containing greenhouse gases, and how we create the political will to look beyond narrow nationalistic objectives so we might play our part in achieving global change. The first is La Trobe alumnus Tim Flannery. After completing a BA at La Trobe, Tim completed an MSc in Earth Science at Monash University and then a PhD in paleontology at the University of New South Wales. He's held many positions, including chairs at the University of Adelaide and Macquarie University, a visiting chair at Harvard, and a professorial fellow appointment at the University of Melbourne. He's been the director of the South Australian Museum and principal research scientist at the Australian Museum. He was Chief Commissioner of Climate Commission, established by the Gillard government, and when that was abolished as one of the first acts of the Abbott government in 2013, he and his fellow commissioners obtained funding from the public to establish the Climate Council, which recently celebrated its 5th birthday, and he continues as its chief counsellor. Tim is world-renowned as an activist in climate change. He's written many books, amongst the best known of which are The Future Eaters and The Weather Makers, and more recently, Here on Earth, which is on sale tonight. He was Australian of the Year in 2007. As mentioned, the science of climate change is only the beginning of a challenge. Achieving political decisions that might involve some short-term pain for some people and industries is the other big challenge. We are fortunate to have, as our second panellist, someone who has made it her life's work to study and advise on ways to solve this wicked problem. Professor Robyn Eckersley is Professor and Head of Political Science at the University of Melbourne. She completed a law degree at the University of Western Australia and has a PhD in environmental politics from the University of Tasmania. She has published widely in the fields of environmental politics, political theory and international relations, with a special focus on the ethics, politics and governance of climate change. Her 1992 book, Environmentalism and Political Theory, was one of the first to argue for an ecocentric form of government. And in her 2004 book, The Green State, Rethinking Democracy and Sovereignty, Professor Eckersley explored what it might take to create a government where the regulatory ideas and democratic procedures are informed by ecological considerations. Her 2013 book, written with Peter Christoph, was titled Globalisation and the Environment, and it's also on sale here tonight. Her current research project is a cross-national study of climate leaders and laggards, and Australia is one of the case studies. You can imagine in which group it falls. Please welcome both our panellists to what I'm sure will be a lively discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, and thank you very much to La Trobe, to Robert Mann, and all the others, including Alice, who've helped to prepare for this evening. I've decided to kick off with a question to Tim. We're just going to pose some questions to each other. I'm going to start, Tim, by simply asking you, are we in a climate emergency? Because we're here to talk about that and what's to be done, but we need to establish, do we have an emergency here?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, Robyn. Before I answer it, though, could I just acknowledge Robert Mann, too, and his role in bringing this all together. It's a fabulous occasion, and really very important. These events are important to our democracy. But in terms of answering your question, I think it's useful to distinguish between an emergency and a crisis, in a way. And I would argue that we've been in a climate emergency for at least a decade. And what I mean by that is that there has been enough gas in the air and we have a forward commitment to more greenhouse gas in the air, to push us over 1.5 or even 2 degrees of warming. So we've been in that perilous position for the last decade. And I would call that a true climate emergency, right? Because you are committed by your current actions and the difficulty of changing course to a bad outcome. The moment of global climate crisis, though, is harder to define. We've already had local crises. We are starting to see the emergence of global crises, and one I'd just like to point to is the deteriorating food security situation globally, where, for 3 years in a running now we've had an increase in hunger, human hunger. So for decades we were building a food buffer, we were serving people better. The last 3 years, due to extreme weather events, we've gone backwards. So if we continue on that trajectory, we'll be facing a true crisis, right? The other crises that we can think about would be the loss of the polar ice cap in summer, the North Polar ice cap, the Arctic ice cap. That will start to change the circulation, planetary circulation, in oceans and in atmosphere in very undesirable ways. And the current projections are that we'll face that moment sometime around 2030. The loss of the ice is so great. So yes, we're in an emergency, we're yet to face a crisis, and we are not acting appropriately, really, in view of either of those issues.
Well, can I follow up there? Because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, has produced 5 assessment reports. But I'm increasingly reading criticisms from other scientists saying that they tend to err on the side of caution, to avoid drama and so forth. And each line has to be agreed politically, not just scientifically. Yes. And so if this is supposedly the best peer-reviewed science we have to advise governments about climate policy, are they perhaps not looking at the so-called fat tail, the not quite so probable events that could be potentially catastrophic, and maybe think more in terms of scenario planning across the board? That's probably me.
Yeah, that could well be me too.
So do you think that it's underestimating some of the risks and not properly incorporating those feedback mechanisms, like the melting of the permafrost and some things that haven't been properly modelled in the projections?
Look, I think a good example of that really concerns the way the IPCC frames up the global carbon budget. The global carbon budget is very important because it tells us how much more greenhouse gas we can emit before we cross a certain threshold, so 2 degrees of warming or 1.5 degrees of warming or whatever it is. And the first big failure really is a failure of imagination, I would say, that how do we comprehend that gigantic river of hydrocarbons which is being squeezed out of our Earth's crust every year? Total human emissions of CO2 now are on the order of 50 to 55 gigatons. The latest figures we've got are from 2008, so we don't have good global figures, but they're in that range. So how big is that? Well, one way of thinking about it is, say, let's imagine what we'd need to do to draw down just 10% of that stream by doing something we can all imagine, like planting trees. So how many trees would we need to plant to draw down just 10% of that great river of hydrocarbons going up into the atmosphere? And the answer is you'd need to cover the United States of America, including Alaska, in a vigorously growing forest to draw down just 10% of what we currently put up there, right? You can think about it another way. You can think, well, how many people would we need to vaporise and put into the atmosphere to equate to that number? Now there's, 7.4 billion of us. We weigh average of 30 kilograms maybe. So, you're getting to the point where you've got to almost put us into the atmosphere twice over every year, right, to get to those volumes. So the scale of the problem is the starting point for comprehension of what we need to do. And IPCC is failing to fire us imaginatively in terms of comprehending that vast volume of fossil fuels and greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere.
Because I don't think it's fully appreciated how long carbon dioxide emissions remain in the atmosphere if they're not reabsorbed, and that's not to mention methane and other greenhouse gases.
Indeed, and just in terms of that, so CO2, for every tonne we put up in the atmosphere, half a tonne will still be there a century later, and a quarter of a tonne will be there forever on a geological timescale. It's not going anywhere in the tens of thousands of years. So as we do that damage and place that CO2, it stays there. But just to get back to the carbon budget, the other issue I have with the IPCC is that they say their best estimate is that we've got about 20 years worth of emissions at current rates before we cross the 2-degree threshold. There's a couple of problems with that. One is that the IPCC assumes that the carbon budget is a stationary thing, right? So, and what that means is that of all of that CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere, about half of it is drawn back into the Earth's crust, the oceans, or the living biota by things like photosynthesis or just absorption of CO2 into the atmosphere. So the IPCC assumes that that's a fixed budget. And we know very well now that it isn't, for a number of reasons. One is just that as the Earth warms, metabolism changes. So bacterial respiration in the oceans and in soils changes. That means less of the carbon that's drawn into the soils in the ocean stays there. Right? As the ocean warms, it's less capable of holding CO2 and other gases. As the poles melt, more CO2 and methane are released from permafrost. As the forests die from bark beetle infestation or just a drought, as we see in the Amazon, yet more carbon is released. So, if you add up all of those sources and say, well, how much will that cost us by 2100? The answer is about 235 gigatons of CO2. So just hold that in your head for 1 second, right? 235 gigatons. Add that to the other problem of the IPCC carbon budget, which is that nitrous oxide and methane emissions are not counted, and they represent about 17% of warming potential overall, on the basis that particulate pollution cools the planet by about the same amount. So particulate pollution is that brown smog you see over Asian cities quite often, and was, in fact, you'd see it in London up until the 1960s. So that's a fair enough trade-off, but what it fails to recognise is that now China and India are going very hard at cleaning up their air. So China particularly have targets. They understand that this is disastrous for human health and the air needs to be cleaned up. So as they clean up the air, the offsetting, if you want, the cooling of it is lost, and we have to account for that extra warmth.
So effectively, this global dimming effect that all that pollution, air pollution has masked the degree of warming that would be happening were it not for that. China cleans up its act and it accelerates.
Exactly.
Which is a terrible irony.
It is.
Yes.
So add the 235 gigatons from the changing nature of the carbon sinks to that 17% from methane and nitrous oxide that'll be released, and you're already at a carbon budget for 2 degrees. So that's the reality. And so the way the exercise is done by the IPCC, I think, doesn't give us the full picture.
Well, we know that 2 degree was the guardrail agreed back in Copenhagen in 2009, and it was reaffirmed in the Paris Agreement in 2015. But thanks to the High Ambition Coalition, this moral coalition led by Tony de Broom from the Marshall Islands, they came in and said, we're not going to sign off here unless you put 1.5 degrees in that document, because this is an existential risk to small island developing states and, of course, least developing countries. And so the big emitters did that as part of the grand bargain. As you know, there's an IPCC report. I think you may have some hot news off the press here, because we've all been waiting with bated breath for this new report, again at the insistence of the more vulnerable parties to the Paris Agreement, for the IPCC to have a report on what the impacts of 1.5 degrees are. And that was supposed to come out just before the next conference of the parties in Poland, in Katowice, this November, December. So Tim, have you got any information about that report?
Sure. Look, the 1.5 degree report that was commissioned by the nations that make up the IPCC is currently being finalised in Incheon in South Korea, starting today. It'll be a 2-week process. The great fear is, of course, that some of those nations will decide they don't want the report. So even though it's written, it is entirely legal for, say, the US and Saudi Arabia, just to pick 2 nations at random, may decide that they don't want the report, right? And then it won't be released formally through the IPCC process, because I say it's not necessary. So, but the report itself is really, I haven't seen the full report. I've talked to people who are involved intimately in the authorship of it.
Yeah.
And I've seen the leaked drafts, as you have, and so forth. But the key issue for that was that really at the time that 1.5 was put into the Paris Agreement, we were already committed to 1.5 if we did nothing but cut emissions. So the great unknown in this is the extent to which we can draw CO2 out of the atmosphere by utilising either very new technologies or technologies that are very early on the developmental pathway. So that's going to be the challenge. And is it 10 gigatons a year? Is it 20 gigatons a year? Will make a huge difference. And keep in mind, 20 gigatons a year are 4 United States worth of tree planting. Right, so we're talking here about very, very large scale.
I want to get back to you on that, but when I teach climate change to students, I say it's not just about mitigation. There are actually 4 elements to the climate change challenge. The first is mitigation, that is reducing emissions from source. The second is adaptation, because there's a certain degree of warming already locked in and we need to do things differently to adapt. The third is intervention, that is deliberate technological intervention to either have more carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, and I'll get back to you on that, or through solar radiation management, which has some real issues. That's the worst of the geoengineering. And the fourth issue is loss and damage, and that is how do you deal with the harmful impacts that will be suffered by the least well-off in this world, who are totally undeserved. And that's the Warsaw Mechanism and loss and damage. So there are 4 big issues here in thinking about this climate challenge. So let's get to back to this 1.5 degrees. The assumption is that we have to get to net zero emissions by mid-century. And then if we're going to get to 1.5 degrees, we then have to have massive carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere in the second half of this century. I finished supervising a PhD student who's looked at emissions from land and the available technologies, and she said she's found that the amount of land that's needed for the degree of drawdown that's required is so vast that it will impinge upon agriculture, will add to the food security crisis you're talking about, lead to higher prices for food and displace a lot of peasant populations. And she said the assumptions that the modellers did were not very clever, really. They didn't really think this through, and which means that the potential for carbon dioxide removal through rapidly growing trees, capturing the carbon dioxide and burying it is actually much less than what the models were anticipating. So what's your view about that? And are there other options on the table?
Well, she's absolutely right about that. If you look out to 2100, we see that the estimates for population are between 9 and 11 billion people on the planet. We're currently at 7. We'll have an Africa with 4 billion people, most likely. That's not the sort of world where we can use the land surface to grow trees and then burn them and sequester the carbon dioxide somehow in the rocks of the planet, which is the current, when the IPCC considers this their main, the kind of rubric, if you want, that they use, trick is called BECCS, BECCS, which is the biological energy, then carbon capture and storage. So, which means taking trees or other green matter, burning it, siphoning off the CO2 and pumping it deep underground into rocks, which will then hold it, they hope, forever.
And it's the growing of those trees that sucks the CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Indeed, and that's not going to work. The rocks aren't there. It's expensive. We've got some carbon capture and storage plants in operation at the moment at a reasonably large scale, and they're just not economic, nor are they effective. So at the gigaton scale, it's not going to work. We've got to do something different. And as we discussed, world hunger is now increasing. So this is one of these issues where that's an absolute emergency. You can't let that go on. And we know why it's increasing. It's increasing because of extreme climatic events. Right, so we've got to build food security for people first and foremost. So how do we do that at the same time we're going to draw CO2 out of the atmosphere? And that's a big, big question. Along with all of those other adjustments, when we talk about a warming planet, we are affecting the metabolism of an organism. So problems will not just break out in one area, they will be systemic, right? So we have to have a mindset that we're going to deal with this at a systemic global level. Returning to the issue that you raised of how we get the CO2 out of the atmosphere, I'm a judge on what's called the Virgin Earth Challenge. Richard Branson in 2007 set up this challenge. I should just tell you how it happened because it's a bit funny. I was walking down the street in Sydney and my mobile phone rang and I was a bit distracted and said, "Hello, it's Richard here," with this lovely cultivated English accent. I I said, oh, hello, Richard, how are you? You know, he said, would you come to my island and talk to my staff about climate change? And then I knew it was that Richard, you know. So it kind of, the ticket winged its way to me on Virgin, unsurprisingly, and I went off to his island in the Caribbean and I spent a week talking with him about climate change as we knew it in 2007. And he said at the end of that week, he said, look, my business is knowing people. It's not really about money, it's about people. And he said, I don't think we are going to come to this area, to an agreement quickly enough to do anything about this, and we'll face a disaster. And I said, oh, Richard, look, I'm chairing the Copenhagen Climate Council. We've got a good political process in place. I'm sure COP15 is going to pay off. It'll be all right. And he said, no, I really want to do something. And he said, I want to have an insurance policy. And that should be some way of getting some of the gas out of the air because we're going to overshoot. And so that's how the Virgin Earth Challenge was born. And myself, Al Gore, and a couple of others are judges on that thing. We will have some exciting news soon about the VEC.
You're keeping it under wraps.
We are, but we've been now looking at entries for 11 years, 12 years. We've looked at 11,000 entries. Been an incredible process. At the end of the day, there's kind of half a dozen approaches at most that can draw down CO2 at the gigaton scale. You know? So there are trees, clearly, but the problems we've identified. There's the soil carbon store, which is about twice as large as the living carbon store, but again, relatively constrained because we need land for agriculture and so forth. And then there is the oceans. And plants grow in the oceans. Seaweed grows in the oceans. So the oceans are 71% of the Earth's surface. Seaweed, because it doesn't need trunks or roots or anything, it grows 30 times or more faster than land-based plants. And you have a ready carbon sink. You don't need to burn it and put it into the rocks because any seaweed that sinks below a kilometre is sequestered on a century-long scale or multi-century long scale. So we've been looking at that as an option, and it really is one of the very few technological approaches that gives you a gigaton, you know, or more.
But it's important for people not to think, okay, we can sit back and relax, we have some technological solutions here. This is necessary on top of global emissions falling off a cliff rapidly within the next decade. They have to fall off a cliff regardless. And this is the backup to stop.
That's right.
Because those CO2 emissions concentrations in the atmosphere will linger for a century. If we don't draw those down, then the Earth will keep warming, even if we were to turn off emissions tomorrow completely. So this is like the backup plan. So we should not be lulled into thinking the problem's solved. But it's great to know there are some new technologies. I
have to really clarify that a bit and go back to that first question you asked me about an emergency.
Yes.
So you can think about it this way, that if we'd acted in 1992 when the Rio Earth Summit had happened, we would have had an easy glide pathway by doing nothing but switching to clean energy, which would have kept us safe from dangerous climate change. You know, if we had acted at the Copenhagen meeting, we would have, if we'd pulled out all stops, possibly been able to stay safe from dangerous climate change just by cutting emissions. We're now in a period where that is not enough. So just by cutting emissions, just by making them fall off a cliff, is still not going to be enough to keep us safe. What we need now is the drawdown of CO2 out of the atmosphere at scale within coming decades to keep us safe. Probably 2 decades from now, I don't want to say exactly when, if we haven't acted, even that won't be enough. So you've gone from emergency to crisis to beyond crisis. And I don't want to be living in a world where we've done that, because you're then committed to a very bad outcome. So this is the last chance to act.
And I think the medical analogy about crisis works best here. It's a critical turning point whereby if you don't take rapid, drastic response, the patient will die or suffer some permanent impairment. And that patient, of course, is Earth systems and so literally, you know, human societies around the globe, but particularly the most vulnerable.
What we have to understand on top of that is that because the greenhouse gases are slow acting, that the gas we put in the air today will reach its full warming potential in about 30 years. So we know that this has been a decade of climate impacts, the teens. We've gone from it being a theoretical problem to it being a real problem today that most of us have had direct experience of. The 20s are going to be much worse, right? They will be severe impacts. The 30s are going to be far worse again, and there is nothing we can do about that. We are committed to that by virtue of the trajectory we're on. The 40s, we can start making a difference, but only if we have cut emissions extremely rapidly and built the capacity to draw CO2 out of the air at scale. So that's the challenge we face at the moment.
Yeah, that's a real problem. Of course, the Paris Agreement was hailed as a diplomatic success because anything that is not a total failure is a success in diplomatic terms.
That's right.
And it was a success because the parties managed to find a way of improvising around disagreement. I call it now a global show and tell regime.
Yeah.
Effectively, the parties agreed to have 5 yearly cycles of commitment where they would increasingly ratchet up their ambition. So their first set of nationally determined contributions, as they're called, was submitted in the year leading up to Paris, when they didn't quite know what the shape of the legal agreement was, so you'd expect them to be a little bit conservative. And then they were for 2030, or in the case of the US, 2025. And then in 2023, they've got to come up with another bunch of emission reductions and so forth. So it's supposed to be this increasing spiral of commitment. But the problem is, the nationally determined contributions, you have to make them more ambitious over time, but there's no requirement that you have to achieve them.
No.
There is no penalties.
That's right.
And the facility of review, the stock taking, the first one begins in 2023, although there's a facility of dialogue at the end of this year in Poland, is supposed to be facilitative and non-punitive. So we've kind of got this very softly approach, like DIY climate policy, which flies in the face of what Political Science 101 says about collective action problems, that you need mutual assurance, mutually agreed upon, of the sort you did have in the Kyoto Protocol, but of course that's in bad odour by certain countries that would not be able to ever follow that model.
Well, the Kyoto Protocol was the model, the top-down model. And it was interesting to see what happened with that, because Canada failed spectacularly to live up to its obligations and owed $1 billion under the protocol, never paid up, and with a blue beret sent in by Ban Ki-moon to collect the money.
It shamelessly walked away from the agreement.
Because you can't do that. You can't. And this is, I'm not so dismayed at the nature of the current agreement, because I think those other agreements, the era of the treaty's over. The world doesn't work like that. We don't have a global mechanism to enforce them. And if I know you've got something to say about that, but could I just go on a little bit and say that what Paris did, which was supremely important, was send a signal to business that the free ride in terms of carbon dioxide emissions was over. And I know, because I ran the biggest business meeting to deal with climate change in the lead up to COP15 in Copenhagen. We had 8,000 people at that meeting, including CEOs of all the majors. Back then, they were interested in action. They wanted to know. Paris gave them clarity. So what we're seeing now is that business and technology are leading politics by a long way. We see it in Australia with the energy companies. I mean, you know, AGL wants to close down Liddell Power Plant, right? And the government doesn't want them to do it.
And the Minerals Council is disagreeing with our new energy minister that we actually would have gone along with the neg.
Yeah, that's right.
That includes big coal in Australia.
So the politics now will always lag behind action. But what is happening globally is really, really heartening. It really is.
Well, it's a mixed story, though, because the Paris Agreement is a diplomatic success story. There are, for the first time, long-term goals and targets and timetables for peaking that we've never had before. We've got both China and the US in. Neither of them were in the Kyoto Protocol. So this is an achievement. And we've got, I think the 1.5 degrees in there was a huge victory for the most vulnerable parties. So all of that's good. And the fact that they've got this thing now happening as a durable, permanent treaty, you know, for the rest of this century, means that we don't have to keep negotiating a new treaty. We do have to negotiate the more detailed rule book. There are big debates going on about climate finance. Differentiation is coming back in as a sore point for China and India, who are in this group called the like-minded group of developing countries. And of course that's recreating the old antagonisms, which will never go away. But there is some major problems with the initial framework convention that was written back in 1992. And that's what fossil fuels were only mentioned twice. And only to appease Saudi Arabia, who was worried about the impact on their economy from climate policies by other countries. And that was the only reason it was put in there. And you'd think, surely, with fossil fuels being the major source of emission, why wouldn't you have a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, a mad idea that I've had? which clearly won't fly right now. And so what we saw in the ashes of Copenhagen, that failed COP back in 2009, was this emergence of this idea of the carbon budget and the beginning of an anti-fossil fuel movement, which is a moral movement. And it's funny, if you think about climate policy, it was dominated by economists for a very long time, focusing on the white knight of an emissions trading scheme. This would gallop in and rescue us, and from a textbook economic case, it made sense. Or even a carbon tax. One was you set the quantity and the market will determine the price. The other is you set the price, the market will determine the quantity. They were both carbon prices. They were seen as the most efficient, most flexible from the standpoint of business. And the textbooks were right. But in practice, every single emissions trading scheme that has been implemented has been politicised and made deeply suboptimal.
Yeah.
And so this idea of then just focusing not on reducing emissions, but actually going to the upstream source of the problem, which is fossil fuel extraction, production, and to try and keep that stuff in the ground is now a swelling movement. And it's a really big one, like powering past coal, this new alliance formed in 2017 with states, organisations, and subnational actors. So it's led by Canada and the UK, but has a number of subnational states in America in it. The ACT recently joined. Many organisations. This is going to build momentum. So these are the really important developments that are happening that wouldn't have happened were it not for the big international jamboree that is going to continue, but it's moving around and doing the sort of work that jamboree could not achieve.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think that is clear. But there's something else which has happened. So that's sort of I think about all of that is adding cost to shifting fossil fuel in a way. It's adding political cost, social cost and economic cost by slowing down things through court cases, new regulations and whatever else. But what innovation has given us is the alternative. So the latest solar farms in Australia to be commissioned are signing power purchase agreements at the kind of roughly the cost of 33 cents a kilowatt hour, which is like, I mean, anyone who knows about electricity prices, this, if you would have said 2 years ago this was happening, you would have been labelled insane. This is cheap to the point of being almost free, right? Wind is the same. Overseas, there's even more extraordinary prices. It's 2 cents a kilowatt hour in Chile for the latest solar. So that is giving us a cheap alternative, which means that coal is finished. You know, we're at the point now where if you've got an old clunking coal-fired power plant, you can still run it profitably, barely, against existing solar. You know, so solar might be cheaper to build than coal, but if you've got an existing plant, it's still cheaper to kind of run. 5 years from now, it's going to be cheaper to build new solar and new wind than it will be to run existing coal, in my view. So I think that these technological advances and manufacturing at scale have really changed the game.
They have, and I was at a seminar at the University of Melbourne about 2 weeks ago where Michael Breers, who's head of the Energy Institute, gave a presentation where even if climate change didn't exist as a problem, if you had to think about how you would power up your economy going forward from now, the only way to go is renewables.
Yeah.
It's cheaper. So without even thinking of the moral argument or the huge civilizational challenge that is climate change. So to try and prop coal up now is like King Canute trying to hold back the oceans.
It's too late.
Yes.
It's too late.
Yeah.
So that's not going to happen. I think I might have misspoken before. I said 33 cents a kilowatt hour. I meant 3.3 cents a kilowatt hour.
Oh,
so
okay.
just
Well,
to clarify
that's dirt cheap, almost free.
It's almost free. So, and what will happen as we build those technologies is that they will penetrate ever further into the fossil fuel economy. So one example of that concerns what you do with overnight unwanted wind energy, right? So Siemens and others are currently looking at building a plant in Australia, in southern Australia, to make nitrogenous fertilisers from unwanted overnight wind energy, right? So and most of our nitrogenous fertilisers today are made from natural gas. So 96% of them. So once you use wind energy to competitively make this stuff, you are displacing fossil fuel from an area where it never thought it would face competition. We've got gas pipelines in Australia and a high gas price. We can shandy into those pipelines hydrogen gas made from wind energy to about 15%, cost competitively right now. So we start eating into the marketplace for the fossil fuels. Carbon fibre can now be made, at least in the lab, directly from atmospheric CO2 rather than from fossil fuels. And can I just turn to the oil industry, because it's one of the most interesting. In June this year, one of the kind of most interesting companies, I think, in the world made an amazing announcement. They're called Carbon Engineering. They're in British Columbia. They make biofuels, particularly jet fuels, from atmospheric CO2, right? And they, in June this year, announced they had cracked the $100 a barrel threshold price point, right? So what that means is that oil is currently at $81. If it ever rises to $100, it's going to be head-to-head with clean renewables. And that had never happened before. And this is happening at a time when the CEOs of the big oil companies are telling us the future is big offshore oil, and the cost of accessing that oil is going to be about $100 a barrel.
Yeah.
So we're in the last days of this.
That's fascinating.
This thing, yeah.
But we do need to think about the hierarchy of fossil fuels. We all know coal is the dirtiest, the one we need to focus on first. And oil is next, and gas is often seen as a transition fuel. But that's I guess an unhelpful wager on that, because we should just
totally
leapfrog over the lot.
In fact, they're all tied together, all of these fossil fuels. They rely on the same base, which is geological understanding and mapping and cost for drilling and all the rest of it. And they've all got the same vulnerabilities. So we saw it with renewables and then the need for batteries having a huge impact on transport, because we'll have cars with batteries in future. And then the development of renewables having a big impact on gas, even in sectors where they never thought they'd compete. And when it comes to industrial heat and energy, again, renewables are going to be eating that, because we'll have concentrated solar thermal technologies which produce high temperatures that'll be usable in industrial technologies. And the Indian entrepreneur whose name I can't remember at the moment, who's working in South Australia, with his bid, a steel plant and a $1.5 billion investment using clean energy in industrial processes. That is amazing.
He's working with Ross Garner's working
exactly.
with him,
So we can see how fast these transitions are going to happen. So I'm not worried so much about emissions reductions. I think we're there. What I worry about is the overhang. It's the hangover from the party, and that's the CO2
But
in
if
the
we are in
atmosphere.
such a climate emergency that global emissions have to fall off a cliff, it seems to me we need to not only give renewable energy all the help it needs, we not only need to think of a price on carbon as a complementary measure, we also need those supply side solutions. We need to phase out fossil fuels. So you put the brake on that, you put the accelerator on the renewable energy, and you think about other economically efficient tools, which if you've got a whole suite of measures, they don't have to do quite so much heavy lifting, and they're likely to be a little more politically palatable. There's about 19 emission trading schemes around the world. The EU is the most ambitious and the most well known, but it's not had the best track record. No. California's next, but then they have this suite of regulatory measures, including prescriptive regulation, that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. China's now beginning, but we're not getting a lot of information on that just yet to see how it's faring. So they haven't been the white horses I mentioned earlier, but they're not necessarily a bad thing to have.
No.
They've been turned toxic in our own environment, but they don't have to be. And if you look at the short-lived effects of the Gillard government's Clean Energy Future package, which had... It was not a carbon tax, it was an interim price on carbon in a fixed interim price in an emissions trading scheme. That saw our emissions go down, and then they bounced, and now they're going up again since Tony Abbott repealed that legislative package. So it did work.
It did work. About 9 months to undo all of the good work we've done in terms of emission bounce back. But look, can I say you're right? And the classic example of this is Australia, where bad policy is holding us back to a shocking extent, truly shocking extent. Good policy can accelerate the transition, bad policy can hold it back. So I'm not doubting that at all, and I think we need all of those things that you say. But what I am saying is that we're now in a favourable position to use those tools in a very smart way. So let's think through them. So in terms of a carbon price, there's an unimpeachable argument that a sectoral carbon price in the cement and concrete industry is a no-brainer, right? Because we already have carbon neutral and carbon negative building materials, which are about 3% more expensive than conventional concretes and cements. So if you had a sectoral carbon price of just 4% in that sector, you'd obviously be changing things, right? Very rapid transition. That's sort of important. So just doing that would be good. when it comes to fossil fuels, getting rid of the subsidies would be enormously helpful, right?
That's the first
38 cents a
no-brainer,
litre diesel subsidy. I mean,
Yeah.
God, what are we doing, you know? So get rid of that. And then if you want, put a carbon tax on, but cut a cheque for every Australian taxpayer or every Australian with that money.
That's the cap and dividend
Yeah.
approach,
And
or
that
tax
way
and
it's
dividend, which is
harder,
favoured
it's-
by the few Republicans in America that
That's
take
right.
climate
And
change
indeed
seriously.
in British Columbia, which has one of the most successful carbon taxes
Yeah.
in the world, $30 a tonne,
Yeah.
every year people get a tax benefit from that.
Speaking of Republicans, though, are all the climate denialists in Australia in hiding now, do you think? They've gone a bit quiet, I've noticed, in recent years. It's more about downplaying the problem now because
Well-
it's just not credible anymore to deny the science.
Look,
Although Abbott did give a speech on that not that long ago in London. But are they sort of going to be rounded up with a black helicopter in the Grand Canyon one day when they're down to their last dozen of them?
I'm hopeful they'll be voted out, many of them, in this next election.
Yeah.
And partly, I could say that's partly because the climate change situation has worsened and people now live climate change, they see it in their life. But partly, I hope you don't mind me saying it, because of the work of the Climate Council and other entities like that have raised awareness of the problem and done a lot of work behind the scenes and well as in front of the cameras to bring that change about. So I'm really hopeful. I might be just an inherent optimist, but I am hopeful at this election we will see a shift and a number of those people will be voted out. I'd love to see their power broken completely in politics. But my strong suspicion is that if we get good policy in at this next election and can hold on to that for, say, 2 electoral cycles, we won't be hearing 5 years from now anything more about coal. The battle will be over.
But there's still so much more that can be done in climate change communication. Like, there are considerable advances in what's called climate attribution science that can actually say when a freakish weather event happens, to what extent that's been amplified by climate science. And so you've written a famous book called The Weather Makers. I'd like to talk about the people on TV and the radio who tell the weather. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we reached a point where they were able, whenever there was a storm coming or a major fire or flood, where they can actually attribute how much of that enhanced, that beefed up version of weather that we usually get is actually attributable to climate science or to climate change, and that was done routinely.
That's right.
Because people trust the weather folk for some reason. They don't trust politicians, not at all, but they trust people who do the weather. And if they could be talking this all the time, then maybe it would just start to saturate within the community.
Yeah, it would. I mean, you're quite right to be lovely. I'd love to see that. But, you know, that attribution work that's been done by climate scientists is really only 3 or 4 years old now. And when we talk about projection work, so this is backcasting, so we can say that a cyclone had happened a month ago. We've now done a very complicated analysis that needs to be done, and we can say that it was 80% more likely because of climate change. But when it comes to projecting into the future, say next week we're going to have a storm and it's 80% more likely, I think we're still a bit away from that in terms of just technical capability. But it would be great to see, and perhaps one day we'll be there.
So Tim, how do you talk to Conservatives about climate change? Like if you were sitting down with any of the group that deposed Malcolm Turnbull, who want to bring back coal, how would you try and bring them around?
I've done a little bit of work in this area. Can I?
Yeah.
So I'm a founding board member of the only non-for-profit organisation on the planet that is looking at carbon negative technologies. Right? It's a Californian-based group. We spent some time in the lead up to the last Trump budget trying to get some measures in that would be meaningful. And we had a Democrat senator and a moderate Republican working to sponsor the particular initiative, and it was adopted, and it's in the budget. And what that initiative is effectively a shadow carbon price in the US for carbon. So it's a $50 a tonne tax credit for what is called geological sequestration of carbon. And there's some rules around it. The thing will run for 12 years. So there's some rules around it that too complex to talk about here. But what that does, because geological sequestration will be defined by the agencies and not the Republicans, it may be and should be that seaweed, which is dropped into the deep ocean, might qualify for geological sequestration. It may be that the use of Greenland rock flower, a tree from glacial snouts in Greenland and weathered in fields to create soil fertility and draw carbon down at the same time will be counted as geological sequestration. Yeah, it may be that carbon engineering type approaches, biofuels or whatever, as long as you sequester the carbon, will be counted the same way. There's also a $35 a tonne tax credit for productive use of CO2. And there's definitely a case where if you're making carbon fibre from atmospheric CO2, you should get the tax credit, right? So to get that through the Trump budget, in my mind, was an enormous success, right? It's unhailed, people don't know about it, but it is there. So you've got to work with the powers that be in smart ways to get stuff in place.
But there are some moral issues here, because I've done a lot of work on climate change communication. I've got research students looking at climate Republicans in America. There's, probably haven't heard of the Green Tea Party, have you?
No.
An alliance between conservative Tea Party woman, her name's Ms. Dooley, and the Sierra Club, that managed to force the utility company in Georgia to have a renewable energy portfolio. And she did it for impeccable conservative reasons. There's a green evangelical movement, getting all its sucker from the Bible, in terms of if you want to show how you love your neighbour, what would Jesus drive? He would drive a Prius.
He'd walk.
There are all sorts of interesting little groups starting up, trying to, and as someone who studies political ideology, I would wager that every single political ideology under the sun can support some degree of environmental action generally, or climate action in particular. But you do need to, it usually needs to come from someone in the in-group. An outsider cannot do that, because they do not listen, because you're not one of them. However, insofar as you can do all this without mentioning climate change at all, like getting policy change by stealth, there's something problematic about that for me. I think we do need to talk about climate change. And I think that getting policy through by stealth is undemocratic. I think the debate needs to be had. And so what worries me is that we have no climate change champions in Australia. Perhaps John Hewson, but he's not in Parliament anymore. But we don't have any in the Parliament at the moment. We thought Malcolm Turnbull would be that person, but he wasn't. So why are none of them popping their head above the parapet and saying this is a problem, when they all know deep down it is?
Can I just, again, just go back to what you said a moment ago about doing it undemocratically? I guess you could argue that carbon credit or shadow carbon tax in the Trump budget was undemocratic, but then the whole budget is sort of such a complicated thing.
No, I don't have a problem with that. I'm about the more general issue of we've got to talk about climate change.
So the way that we work at the Climate Council is, I know if I go into regional Australia, into conservative farming seats, people are not going to listen to me because I'm an outsider. So we have a thing called the Climate Media Centre, which tries to recruit people who are concerned about climate change in critical areas like farming, emergency services, fire and so forth, and the medical fraternity. And we take those people and we upskill them in terms of their knowledge of climate change, and then give them media skills to go out and speak. And this is something which we do kind of below the radar, really. But we try to create champions in those critical areas, and they are changing things. So you go out to regional Australia now and talk to farmers, partly due to the fact that climate change impacts have grown, but partly due to the fact that there are legitimate voices in their own community identifying the problem and calling for solutions. We're seeing a massive change. So the head of the National Farmers Federation has recently said, this is an issue, we have to deal with it. And the drought stuff has come out. People are saying, we don't just want drought relief, we want people to understand that things are changing.
I think the debate about drought relief at the moment has been a real hook to get these issues. You have to start joining the dots. I grew up in a conservative rural community, and I can talk to farmers because they know my dad.
Yes,
they wouldn't otherwise talk to me, but they know my father.
Indeed,
My 91-year-old mother still has her rain gauge, and she knows the difference between weather and climate, and she knows things aren't the same. And she knows something's up. So I think there's enormous potential for rural Australia to start. And this is where we have to think about adaptation. And what it is we grow. Why do we have to use crops that use so much water? We need something that can deal with greater heat and so forth, or rising temperatures. So I think there's so many conversations to be had across not just mitigation but adaptation.
And just to return to your issue about Parliament, I think that there are climate champions in Parliament. I mean, we've got some Greens, for example. You know.
But I'm just saying on the conservative side of politics,
On
they're a
the
bit thin on the
conservative
ground.
side, I mean, there was people like Mal Washer who were, you know, real champions who stepped down, since, as you said, Hewson and others. But what I think's happened in Australian politics is that the whole country has been held to ransom by a small group of either denialists or lobbyists or people who, for whatever reason, just don't want to change and engage with the issue. And I think it's their power that's going to be tested at this next election.
I think hugely, because what's so fascinating from a political science point of view, if you look at the opinion polls, starting from 2007 to the present, which the Lowy Institute have been keeping, when Rudd ran for Prime Minister back in 2007, Australia's concern about climate change was very high, and it gradually dropped all the way down to 2012.
Yeah.
You can guess where that is, and then it's gradually kicked up. And right now, it's climbing back to almost where it was in 2007. So over 80% of Australians strongly support renewable energy. And a solid 2/3 would be happy for climate action, even if it costs something and put us at some competitive disadvantage with our trading partners. So that's what the Australian public thinks. What is our parliament thinking? What is our parliament doing? It is way out of touch with the electorate, which is an extraordinary lesson in how our systems of political representation, our systems of choosing candidates, the selectorate, not the electorate, shape so much of politics, how we've got a voting system that entrenches the incumbency of the major parties, how they're institutionally designed to hate each other and not cooperate when we really need a bipartisan solution to this problem. In the cross-national study that I've been doing, what makes a leader, what makes a laggard, the single biggest predictor of success in any country are conservative climate champions.
Yes, wow. That's good. Yeah,
That's the one single finding that holds for all the countries. Like Angela Merkel's been in the climate chancellor, she's called. She's wobbling a bit at the moment, but the long story is a good story. And countries like Norway, where you've got a conservative government, in alliance with the Progress Party, which is a right-wing populist party, they're hanging on firm to what was agreed by the previous Social Democratic Party. And so this seems to be the biggest and most important thing. So it has to do with the political party configuration and what's going down in conservative politics.
Look at the Liberals in South Australia, you know.
Yeah.
They've adopted wholesale the Labor, you know, policy around clean energy pretty much. And they continue.
Well, that's good news,
which
yes.
is great, yeah.
Yeah.
So it can happen. No, you're absolutely right. But in terms of government policy, you know, the great sleeper is still this failure to foster innovation for carbon drawdown, because we now know we will need that at scale. And we can't just click our fingers overnight and create enough seaweed farms, for example, or enough other technologies, you know, direct air capture locations to make a difference. These technologies need to be developed over long time frames, much like wind and solar. So in the 1970s, wind and solar energy was many thousands of times more expensive than conventional energy, but it was fostered and grown, and now it's the solution. Right?
Yeah.
So carbon negative technologies need the same trajectory. So we need to start investing now for solutions by 2040 or 2050. So to me, sensible government policy in this area has to, first of all, drive down emissions as hard and fast as we possibly can with all of the tools you talked about. Right? But secondly, to have a very substantial innovation fund whose ultimate objective is to turn our economy from a carbon-emitting economy to a carbon-absorbing economy. Unless we do it at the economy-wide scale, we will fail to stay below 2 degrees.
Well, the way the Paris Agreement's supposed to work is to set off a green beauty contest. And I think that's a great way of proceeding. But most countries have always seen responding to climate change as some kind of cost rather than a new opportunity. But I think now they're beginning to shift, particularly with the plummeting price of renewables. But I don't want governments to lose sight and publics to lose sight of the moral challenge, because this is a civilizational challenge and it's a massive structural injustice.
Yes.
Why? Because those communities and small nations that are least responsible for putting emissions into the atmosphere and have the least capability to adapt are going to be impacted the worst. That's a treble injustice. And it's shocking. It's absolutely shocking. So Australia often talks about the fact that our emissions are only about 1.5%, but we're in the top 20. we're about number 14 of
Yes,
aggregate
exactly.
emitters.
14, yeah.
We've got a giant Yeti carbon footprint,
Yes.
and we are not looking after our brothers and sisters in the Pacific.
Yeah.
And you talk to anyone in any Pacific Islander, they are very disappointed in Big Brother over here.
Yeah.
We're not looking after. We are the hegemon in the region. So I think that moral challenge is something that it's not being narrated at all. We're not hearing enough about it. And it's about hearing the problem in a way that's calibrated to a solution and leading with a moral argument, but then showing all the co-benefits, health, resilience, innovation, new industries, more jobs. I mean, what's not to like about it? It's a no-brainer. But we're not getting that big narrative. I've not really heard it yet in this country.
No.
But because I've been doing a discourse analysis of speeches of prime ministers and climate ministers around the world, OECD countries, I'm having trouble being set aflame by the speeches that I've been reading here, from 2007 to 2015, which is the time period for my study. It's kind of just not there.
I would be surprised if there was more than one or two people in our federal parliament who truly understood the nature of the climate challenge, as we've discussed it tonight.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's not part of the narrative that the IPCC kind of unpacks. It's not part of our political narrative. And it is extremely difficult to comprehend how we go from a carbon-emitting economy to a carbon-absorbing one, because the pathways are multifarious, right? And as you say, there's a whole justice issue involved in that too. But we can think about scenarios in our mind that might deal with that. So let's think about the situation in the Pacific Island nations at the moment, right? So a scenario that might create better justice for those people is, first of all, for Australia to slam down as hard and fast as we can on emissions growth, to send that into negative free fall, right? And then to look at the carbon negative technologies and innovations required around that to create new economies and new opportunities for the region. So the current situation is that Pacific Island nations, their oceans are pillaged by fishing fleets. They're going out, 90% of the large fish are already gone, and they're suffering from climate change, right? Including ocean acidity, which is destroying their reefs, and bleaching and so forth. So imagine a situation where Australia puts some serious money into innovation around seaweed farming. Because those island nations are surrounded by deep water, you could imagine ocean-going seaweed farms there where you could grow high-quality protein because the seaweed buffers the sea water and creates ideal growing conditions for fish and shellfish. So they could be growing the protein that others are stealing from nature and selling that commercially to markets in Asia and other places. Right. At the same time, they are paid a carbon price for putting seaweed into the deeper ocean.
So it's a payment for ecosystem service type
exactly,
scheme.
but which suits their local economies.
Yeah.
Now, I don't want to pretend that these are technological perfect solutions, because we don't know what the impacts of sending seaweed at volume into the deep ocean will be.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question.
Exactly.
What would it do to the coral reefs?
We haven't done the due diligence for that, but we can say that one method of seaweed farming is to pump up cold, nutrient-rich water from below what's called the thermocline in the ocean, so the deeper water. Use that to irrigate a crop of seaweed because all the nutrients are there, they'll be absorbed. And that water is cold, very cold water, but it floats at the surface because it's less salty than the water at the surface. So you can imagine a situation where you may drizzle that cold water onto a coral reef during a heat wave, a bleaching event, to keep it healthy. Now these are big projects which we're nowhere near seeing them now, but I can imagine a future, I can imagine a scenario where we try to create better climate justice through addressing those two key issues of emissions reductions and sequestering CO2 at scale.
It's interesting because the theme of climate justice is on the agenda for the 24th Conference of the Parties in Poland this year. The whole idea of just transition, very, very important. There are some examples of that happening now in some American states, which everyone's studying. But you talk to people in the La Trobe Valley, we've known when all our coal fleets are due to retire for 20 years. And when Hazelwood finally closed, it was like, we've got to do something for the workers, we've got to do something for the community. Could they not see it coming? The Senate held an inquiry on our coal fleet and the ones that we should retire early, which we need to do if we're going to start shifting gear. But of course, that was mainly a Labor and Greens committee, so the government's pretty much ignored it. So there's, I think there's so much more to do in the just transition space, but nonetheless, what you suggested then sounds like something that's worth doing in a small scale, testing,
that's
like
right.
experimental and scaling it up.
Multi-decade approach.
Yeah.
Look, the thing about that, you put your finger on something which is so important, that this failure, repeated failure, to deal with climate justice as the old coal phases out. The problem we have is that we believe coal has a future, and the political parties may cling to this fiction as if there was no tomorrow, And while you maintain that fiction, why would you think about structural adjustment in these coal fields? Something better will come along to use the coal. I mean, we've still got these ideas of making hydrogen from brown coal in Victoria.
I know, it's crazy.
Which is being it's a total madness. So the first thing that we need to do with that is to face the reality that 5 or 10 years from now, solar and wind are going to be competitive against existing coal. It's finished. It's game over. Right, so we need to start preparing those communities now and give them the advantage of proper transitional assistance to a new economy. And we have to start that now, because you can't start at the year of the closing of the plant. It's too late. You need to actually get things in place and consult with people about what they might want.
But if you think that's hard, Adani, I mean, the Australian Institute did some calculations and said that the amount of emissions associated with the coal that would be exported from the Carmichael mine was roughly the equivalent of Australia's emission reductions under the Paris Agreement. And it's crazy because Australia hides behind the production-based accounting rules, because internationally, countries, the emissions attributed to a country are those that are produced within the country, in their territory, over a given accounting period, a year. So if you export all that harm and it's burned somewhere else, you get all the money and you don't cop any blame. Right. So you're exporting harm.
Yep, exactly. Look,
we're being rounded up here.
Yeah, sorry. Adani, big
Last
problem.
point, yeah.
I'm sure our panellists could go on discussing this all night between themselves, but we want to give the audience a chance too to ask questions. So it's over to you to ask our panellists questions. There are two people with red tops with roving mics that will get to you. I'm fairly dazzled by the light, so I find it a little bit hard to see who's asking the questions, but over to the audience now.
There's someone with their hand up in the far corner there.
There's a question there, yeah.
Hi, yes, I'm Jane Morton. I'm just amazed to actually see a La Trobe University event called Climate Emergency, and that seems to be such an enormous advance in itself, because my sort of thought is that we're not going to get emergency action unless people are prepared to actually say it's an emergency or a crisis. But so I'm just very curious and very happy to hear more about how that breakthrough has happened, because there's a lot of large organisations that still just won't use that E word.
I think it's a question for you, Richard. I don't know.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just missed the key bit. How
did it come about that a large organisation like La Trobe is okay to call it an emergency when so many aren't?
I think that we have a lot of confusion in this discussion between gut feelings, ideology, and science. And I think we have very often equal weight given to, on the one hand, gut feeling, economic concerns in the short term, versus science-driven knowledge of what's happening to our climate and the cause for it. La Trobe prefers to follow the scientific line and use best evidence, and also very much the precautionary principle. If we make a mistake in believing that man-made climate change is the cause of the change in temperature, and we're wrong, we will have phased out fossil fuels, we'll have cheap new technologies, and things will be a whole lot better. So that's even in the remote chance that all the scientists are wrong, it's still the right line to take. I think La Trobe would say this is a really crucial problem, and we'd like to do our best to convince for politicians, the editors of certain newspapers, and some of the people in the on radio who are speaking from what they might wish to believe rather than from what the science would say. So Latrobe's behind the science side. So I guess that's my answer to it from Latrobe's point of view. But I don't know whether Tim, as an alumnus, would like to put in a word as well.
It's always been a pretty progressive university, as I remember it. In fact, it was remarkably progressive when I was there. As a student, we took full advantage of it, but it was a fantastic place to study, that's all I can say.
Well, the students wouldn't let us not be progressive, and that's a great thing, and it's one of the big hopes for the future, to be surrounded by students who care a lot more about the future of a planet, and some of our politicians seem to. Yes, over there, and then there.
I can speak loudly, maybe. So I'm on board with everything you're talking about, but one of the things I haven't read as much about is what is it going to take, like what are the calculations currently within the production systems that we have to create these renewable energy sources, because aren't we going to be using kind of the coal-driven, petroleum-based, manufacturing systems to produce these solar panels and things like that? So can you speak a little bit about that, please?
Sure, I mean that is very true, obviously, that we that if you've got a dirty manufacturing base, you've got to use that to produce your initial clean power generation. But the world has moved on quite a lot with that. So South Australia, for example, now it has no more coal in its portfolio. California has just committed to be, for the whole economy, to be carbon neutral by 2045, right? And it's already, the electricity sector's already got very limited fossil fuels in it. So yes, it's a problem. It was much more of a problem 2 decades ago when we were predominantly dirty. 2 decades from now, it's going to be much less of a problem. But that's an inevitability of the way the system runs.
Yes, there, and then there.
You started to touch on Adani, so I thought I'd take us back there. I moved to Townsville 2 years ago, and I see the huge Adani sign on one of the buildings in the city, and from someone who's grown up in a sort of a more progressive area of Melbourne, I find it quite concerning. So I thought I'd bring us back to Adani. I just wanted to hear what you thought it would take to just bury that for good and see where we are with that.
Sure.
Do you want to start?
Yes. Yeah. Or you, do you want to? Have you got?
Well,
something
there are just so many. You often talk about co-benefits of mitigation. There are many disbenefits that, unrelated to the massive one of climate change in relation to Adani, and that's its huge draw on the water table there, which is actually firing up a whole lot of farmers and so forth in the neighbourhood. And then there's Indigenous people who are also very upset about what's happening on their land. So you've got a very broad-based coalition against the Adani mine, and in fact it's not that far off being like another Franklin in terms of the Australian environment movement, because they have a sort of visible campaign against it, but they've also got a lot of supporters working in all walks of life, using their position to try and make their organisation see reason on this particular topic. I mean, it just makes no sense. As I said earlier, the amount of emissions that could be associated with burning the coal that would be exported is huge, and it's a big chunk of the global carbon budget, let alone Australia's. So it's just profoundly immoral at this point in time. It's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. But I think there was a big campaign there, but at least the Queensland government started to back down. They didn't give them support. I think Labor and the Greens are certainly against it. It basically depends, again, on the coalition.
Yeah.
Because they can stop it just like that tomorrow. But the environmental impact assessment gave it the green light. So what does that tell you about our environmental impact assessment project? They just look at each project by project rather than looking at the cumulative effects of a whole vast number of projects of a similar kind. And that's always been the problem with our environmental impact assessment legislation at the federal level. There's so many levels at this. But I guess one of the things we haven't talked about so far is the rise in climate litigation. I think it's really going to be one of the many game changers, because there's a whole confluence of them happening. But not just the regular common law of tort, of negligence, but also the fact that directors have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to disclose any risk to the business. And now the risks posed to any business by climate change are things that corporate directors are going to increasingly ignore at their peril. So there will be more and more litigation on that front. And similarly with, local governments with their planning laws, if they don't take climate change into account when they're changing their building regulations and so forth, they could be subject to legal suits. And we're seeing lots and lots of really interesting legal action in America. A group of kids are taking action against the US government for their failure to stop climate change. And there have been efforts to try and kick it out in lower circuit courts, but so far the case is holding. So we're all watching it with great interest. So litigation is really going to be growing, and I think Adani Corporation, such as it is, is completely vulnerable to litigation.
I'll just add extremely briefly, because I know the situation quite intimately, particularly from the Indian side, that we've had a huge victory already. So the original vision of Mr. Adani was a new port, a new coal port, a new rail line, new coal-fired power plants in India, and a massive trade in coal. His recent announcement has scaled that back massively. So what he's now planning is a narrow gauge, single track train line linking to an existing train line, exporting a little bit of coal out of an existing port. And the reason he wants to do that is that he has just his co-owner of the Mundra power plant in Rajasthan, which is 4,600 megawatts, commissioned the most recent bits of it in 2012, and they can't get a viable supply of coal for that power plant. So, and even though some Indian economists argue that they'll run those things at a loss, and they have never run at a profit, mind you, but continue to run them at a loss through using Queensland coal or Galilee Basin coal, he's still pursuing that much scaled down thing because he's already thrown billions and billions of dollars at this project. That's my guess. So we've already had a very substantial victory. We need to stamp it out entirely, but don't underestimate the good you've already done if you've been protesting, because we have already had some achievements.
Thank you. Yes, lots of hands. So if you can, yes, there first.
Thanks. Cheers. Thank you. Jean Blackley, Drawdown Australia. A question for both yourself, Tim, and Robyn, is just tying some of these points you've made together around the fact that leadership being shown in all sectors of society, particularly in corporate and investment, superannuation industry, which of course at $2.7 trillion of funds under management is bigger than the Australian Stock Exchange. The direction they're going with fiduciary responsibilities and risk. We look at the cities like Melbourne and Sydney and state governments, and the fact that about 85% of the Australian population is covered by a government commitment to net zero emissions by 2050 or earlier. The Lowy Institute poll, 2006, when it started, when the Howard government was proposing a carbon trading scheme, that was the peak, and we haven't got back to it yet, but we're getting close, as you highlighted. So, Tim, you made the point that a lack of policy can really hold back and inhibit. And it seems like federal government policy is the last sector of Australian society to wake up and get on with the program here.
Yes.
What do you two each think has to change in a scenario where you think only 2 elected politicians in Canberra really understand the emergency and crisis that we've now reached? What has to change with the narrative in Australia, socially and broadly, for, the social climate to demand the political will in this next election, or the election beyond that? How are we going to get the shift we need?
Well, when I started looking at this project quite a few years ago, the focus on leadership was partly because when you've got a problem that's very wicked, very complex layers of science, layers of economic policy that don't translate well in short sound bites, and when it's preventing bad things happening way in the future, you've got a real problem unless you have political leaders taking the front foot and prosecuting that agenda. But we've not seen that. What we're seeing is more leadership from below. It's more distributed leadership, like distributed energy, if you like. And so what needed to happen didn't happen, but what is happening is the public is waking up and it's restless. And the more that happens in the electorates that really count in the next election, that is the single best way. Because for changing the mind of Liberals and the National Party to start taking this seriously. I mean, if the Farmers' Federation is, maybe the Nationals will start to get wise. But certainly there's new candidates wanting to stand in seats where Nationals and particularly the Liberals are somewhat vulnerable, and that's going to be the change. So it's from below. And we're seeing this also in the congressional November elections that are coming up. The Democrats will have a real problem winning the Senate, but they're in with the chance in taking over the House. And again, it's electorate, it's congressional district by congressional district, looking at who's there, rewarding and supporting those that are taking action, and doing the opposite for those who aren't. And I think that's people power at its best. That's how democracy is supposed to work. These are supposed to be our political representatives, and they're not doing their job.
Yeah, I'm broadly in sympathy with that. I think that's right. But I do think this coming election offers a very special opportunity to do something. High levels of engagement with climate change, previously safe seats, no longer safe. What I would love to see is a series of independents, local heroes if you want, well esteemed in their communities, stand for election on the basis that they will do it as a public service for one term only, and that they will consult the community through the use of citizen juries on the decisions parliaments to make. I've got enormous faith in the common sense of people when consulted together like that. I saw it again and again as Climate Commissioner around Australia, that people will make the right decision. If we got half a dozen or more independents standing successfully in this next parliament on that basis, we could change the narrative entirely. So we shall see, but I think the opportunity is there.
Okay, so question there in the yellow.
Hi, I'm getting into doing some activism, and I want to know, when I'm talking to people on the street, it's a really emotional issue because it affects everyone.
Excuse me, sorry.
It's a really emotional issue that affects everyone. When you're talking to people to try and convince them, do you feel that way yourself? And if so, how do you deal with that?
Well, I suppose you've got to speak to people in ways that they understand and that they can empathise. And my own way of doing that is really listening to people and asking them questions and trying to get some clarity about what they really think. And, at the best of times, if you do that, you can get people to, when they hear themselves speaking and saying what they then understand are unreasonable things, you can start getting a little bit of change. So, but everyone's different. Some people, like, you doing your activism, the very sight of you doing what you do is probably very powerful, I imagine. But everyone does it in different ways. So thank you for your activism, if I could say that.
Thank you.
Yes, I think what often happens is a cycle. You often start by either getting upset or angry, and then you move to getting engaged. Some people just simply despair. But I think hope is not the same as optimism. Optimism assumes the odds are good, and they're not, actually. Hope is, it's technically possible to turn this around, and if I throw my weight into this, I can help change those odds. And how could I not do that, given what's at stake? And so you can get fired up. And if you work collectively with people, then you get this sense that you can do something. It's very difficult for individuals to, through their little private acts of consumption, to make a difference. Although I'm not to denigrate those, we can always do more when we join together. And I think the more there's unlikely broad-based coalitions, the better, rather than everyone in the echo chambers in their favourite groups or clubs or whatever. I think if you can build some cross-cutting alliances reaching across the aisle, I think that would be so much more productive. And we saw this with the peace movement in the 90s, in the 80s. There would be church groups, there'd be the CWA women's groups and different groups getting involved across the aisle. And I think those sorts of things can be much more powerful than ones that are more like-minded. They're harder to pull off. But sometimes around particular issues, which cut across the ideological spectrum, you can do that. And everyone cares about children. And there's always more than 3 generations living at any one time. And obviously younger folk are going to be more concerned about this than older folk. And women tend to be more concerned than men. And so and that's across the spectrum. So I think that there's, younger folk ought to be involved and are involved, and they certainly care a great deal. And I find that amongst students coming through each year, getting more and more concerned for very good reason.
Yes, if I could comment, I mean, one of our problems is that we tend to aggregate with people like minds, and we're all been talking to committed to a large extent tonight. And I have other circles related to some of my recreational activities that I won't go into, where we could have a completely different type of conversation, and I politely disagree with a lot of people, but if you accidentally get onto Sky News, for example, you think you're in a parallel universe. Or you listen to Alan Jones or Ray Hadley. Fortunately, we don't have anyone quite as bad on radio down here, but again, it's just a different community. And this has become such a polarising issue that the two groups tend not to speak to each other a great deal, and it's one of the problems. And, if you, with your activism, can get to the other side of the ledger, then that would be terrific. Yes, there, and then at the back.
Tim, you gave a similar presentation at the Trobe a few years back, just after the Copenhagen or
Yes.
Sorry, just get the microphone.
Yeah.
Hi, Tim, you gave a similar presentation at the Trobe a few years ago. At that I came away feeling that you're an optimist. Are you still an optimist?
Yes, I am. I think Robyn was quite right in what she said about optimism, but I do remain optimistic. And what I've seen is that since I spoke at La Trobe, which would have been back in about 2013, I'm guessing, 2014, the problem has grown. So that's dismaying. I really thought we had a chance of capping emissions and then to see a slow decline. We haven't seen that. But at the same time, the tools that we will use to cause that decline have grown in their potency. So I'm still optimistic within the next decade we will see that downturn in emissions, and it will just accelerate as it goes on, because the clean energy revolution is upon us, really is.
G'day.
At the back there is next.
There's just one here.
Oh, sorry, go on. You've got the microphone. And then the lady at the back after that. Yep.
Sure. I just had a quick question actually regarding different forms or different ways in which climate change is being addressed in other industries.
Just hold your microphone a bit closer.
Yeah, sure. Is that better?
Yeah, sure.
Obviously, things like energy generation, which is a very large contributor that gets a lot of attention. But there are other areas of our economy, such as agriculture, for example, that do generate significant amounts of emissions. And so I was just wondering if you could briefly touch on some of the efforts being done in other sectors of our economy to address climate change there.
Sure, yeah. Look, there's some really encouraging stuff happening in that area. Just to give you a single example, Sundrop Farms in South Australia is a area of greenhouses of about 20 hectares, which is run from a concentrator solar thermal plant, and it produces about 10% of Australia's truss tomato crop, which are the supermarket tomatoes you buy, joined up, without using a drop of fresh water or barely a drop of fossil fuels, right? And that's because that plant contributes heat, electricity, and desalinisation to the process of growing those tomatoes. That turns everything I thought I knew about agriculture on its head. When I went to school, we were taught to grow things you need fertile soils and abundant rainfall, right? It's not true. Actually, what you need is cheap, reliable, clean energy to do that. So that is an amazing breakthrough. farmers on the ground across the industry are doing extraordinary things. If you want to read a great book about this, Charles Massey's The Call of the Reed Warbler is the book. And he says, traditional Australian agriculture was like a form of torture. You would go out there, a good day was ring-barking trees and gassing rabbit warrens. That was a real fun time, right? And suicide rates on farm were high. People lived with toxins that they were, throwing about, pesticides and herbicides, living in a devastated landscape and basically leading blighted lives without knowing it. And he's a farmer himself, And he said, recently farmers have invented in Australia a new way of doing things. And it goes from zero-till to zero-kill to cell grazing, where they're throwing away all of the pesticides and herbicides and all of those expensive inputs, lowering their risk profile and leading happy lives. They call themselves the lazy farmers, these guys. They do. They're still making profit.
As a footnote to that, keep your eye on New Zealand, because Jacinta Ardern is presiding over a new climate regime where they're going to try and drastically reduce emissions across the economy, including in agriculture, which is their biggest export earner. Now, we know that emissions from beef cattle are very high, much higher than sheep, but they still also have high emissions, and there's, I think, 5 sheep to every 1 New Zealander. Yeah. So they have a really big problem. Agricultural emissions are much harder to tackle than electricity sector, where most of the focus has been. And of course then there's transport and lots of other sectors too. So I would say watch New Zealand. Everyone's going to be watching New Zealand. Yeah.
Right, so back there.
Just a quick question about renewable energy transitions. I've been having a couple of discussions about the sustainability of our minerals with regards to batteries. We've been talking about batteries and the possibility of running out of minerals that are creating batteries and also solar panels. What do you think about the sustainability, Tim, of those renewable energies?
Look, at the moment, the most popular battery type is lithium-ion, and lithium is one of the rare earths, so it's hard to refine. They've all got about the same atomic weight, don't they, if I recall correctly, on the periodic table. So they're difficult to refine, and they can be very polluting to refine. And in places like China, lithium extraction and refining is a dirty process, which is a problem. I think it produces radioactivity, if I recall, but I'm no expert in that area. I don't think it has to be that way. I think if you're willing to pay a bit more and have clean extraction processes, you can do it. Lithium is the 8th most abundant mineral in Earth's crust, so we're in no danger of running out of it. But the extraction process is an issue. Solar panels, the primary element in those is silicon, which is again one of the most abundant elements on the Earth's crust, so I don't think we'll run out of that. But it can be expensive to refine, and you've got to have, under certain conditions you can do it much more cheaply, but they're very restricted. So I guess that question to my mind goes to how do we clean the industrial processes that will lead the new energy revolution, and I don't think there's any insurmountable barriers to doing that. We've just got to pay the price to do it properly.
But in both situations, in the battery situation and in the solar panel situation, there's a large amount of research on new technologies, transitioning from lithium to other technologies for batteries, and similarly with the solar panels, more efficient solar panels. So the technology is advancing over time, and I think reliance on a single sort of component will be overtaken by new technology. And I don't think we've had any significant discussion about nuclear energy, which is also becoming cheaper and safer, and the many nuclear plants that are now being used, not necessarily in Australia, but the impact that nuclear energy will have in places like China and India and Europe. Would you like to make any comment about that?
Well, I'll make a quick comment, although I'm sure Tim's more of an expert here, but certainly the Chinese have reduced the cost of nuclear power because of just the sheer economies of scale. But I would be very surprised if nuclear could compete just on economic cost alone compared to renewables. And you have to say, it has to be properly costed, and typically it isn't. Not just the costs of investing in it, but of managing the waste in perpetuity. And once you add that cost in, it blows it out of the market.
So economic considerations.
Yeah, if you do the proper costing, it will never be economic.
Look, and the truth is capital raising is a big issue for that sort of stuff. You're looking at, I mean, for a conventional nuclear plant, a 2,000 megawatt plant, you're probably looking at $20 billion plus and a payback period of 50 years from time, or 70 years from time of conception. No one's going to put that money into gambling on the price of electricity 70 years from now. Whereas wind and solar, you can buy as many or as few panels or wind turbines as you want.
Yeah.
Tailor the budget, and the payback time's 15 years or less. So, they've won. And the thing about wind and solar, they've not just won against nuclear, they've won against geothermal, tide and wave energy.
Yeah.
They're winning against energy efficiency, which is frightening, but it's happening.
Yeah.
You try to go and look for some heat pumps these days. They're expensive because they're not as many of them made. It's cheaper just to bung some solar panels on your roof and pump out the electricity than to use it efficiently. It's a total game changer in ways we haven't even thought of. It really is.
Well, I think on that very optimistic note we should finish, and I'd like to thank the panellists, but before that I'd like also to draw attention to the next of this wonderful series that's been convened by Robert Mann. And the next episode is on Thursday, October the 11th. It's for something completely different. It's the unfinished feminist revolution, the hashtag #MeToo, and the forgotten women, and that's going to be held at the State Library of Victoria in the Isabella Fraser room, and Jane Caro and Anne Mann are going to be the two panellists. So it'll be the same time in, I think that's about 3 weeks' time, or maybe it's 2 weeks' time, October the 11th. So I invite everyone to come along to that, and the booking mechanism is the same as for tonight. But I'd like to conclude by thanking Robyn and Tim for a most engaging discussion that they had and response to the audience. I'd like to thank the audience for your active involvement and encourage you all to become activists like the gentleman in the back, and persuade your friends who will ultimately persuade the politicians that real action is needed in this really important issue. So Tim and Robyn, thank you very much indeed.